All right, so I'm just doing the apology for the title. Why have I chose this when, we're all friends here and when I've just been editing the journal? But I do want to take a bit of time this afternoon to examine the tradition that we think we represent here. When I was editing the journal, I used to get these sort of reviewer reports fairly regularly, which would say, well, yeah, I like this paper, but it isn't really symbolic interactionism. Now, it has to be said, my editorial team and I were not really very bothered about this sort of boundary work. We sort of wrote a manifesto saying, if people wanted to call their work symbolic interactionist, that was probably good enough for us. I mean, we all believe in labeling here, and it's sort of, if that's the label people want to choose, then we should give them a fair degree of latitude. I mean, we did get some very odd papers that were nowhere near, but I'll talk about those on another occasion, perhaps. But if we believe in labels, we believe in defining situations, we thought if somebody labelled a paper and defined it this way, we should normally respect the decision. But this was a stance that clearly bothered some of our friends in the community, particularly some of our American colleagues, who had a much more definite view of this should be in and this should be out. And they were just a little bit disappointed by the fact that we wouldn't police the boundaries. And I wanted to develop my thoughts on the editorial line because I do think they have implications for how we should be approaching symbolic interactionism here in Europe. And I want to look at three particular issues. First of all, if you've been listening at all so far, you might have noticed that I've been referring to symbolic interactionism as a tradition. And I want to analyse it as such, particularly with reference to its origin myth. How is it that some of our colleagues come to be quite so tribal about a scholarly movement? Secondly, I want to consider the processes by which it has reached Europe. What's the problem in European sociology to which symbolic interactionism might be the answer? And third, I want to consider what these two stories leave out. If we buy into the narrative of symbolic interactionism that's promoted by some of my reviewers, are we really doing the best for our students and our publics, and of course ourselves? Well, it's perhaps appropriate for a presentation in Poland that any starting point for a discussion of myth is really the work of Bronisław Malinowski. In a paper that he published first in 1926, he recalls reading The Golden Bough by Sir James Fraser as a student in Krakow around 1905. The Golden Bough assembles and classifies a large collection of myths from traditional societies. And Malinowski credits this work with inspiring his interest in anthropology or sociology, since, in fact, Malinowski tends to use the terms fairly interchangeably. And although the paper began life as a public lecture in memory and celebration of Fraser, Malinowski actually uses it to develop a critique of Fraser's approach and an alternative research program that has dominated the field ever since. In particular, he takes issue with the kind of literary compilation that was represented by Fraser's work and which is common among 19th century folklorists. Those of you who were at the meeting that Michael organised in Kassel a few years ago remember it's home to the Brothers Grimm, who, of course, were very much working in this tradition. Malinowski argued that what we should really be doing is studying how myths were told in context. The anthropologist has the myth maker at his elbow. Not only can he take down as full a text as exists, he has a host of authentic commentators to draw on. He can see the live context within which the myth is told. The limitation of the study of myth to the mere examination of texts is fatal to a proper understanding of its nature. So what Malinowski is suggesting is that we need to understand the work that myths do for the people who tell them and for the people who listen. The way it expresses, enhances, codifies belief, it deals with morality, it deals with ritual, it has practical rules. It's not an idle tale, but a hard-worked force, a pragmatic charter. It's made to fulfill a certain function, to glorify a certain group, or to justify an anomalous status. And this has continued to influence anthropology subsequently. Eliade, for example, argues that the foremost function of myth is to reveal exemplary models. It doesn't just describe the creation of the world, but it provides the basis for what humans are today. Mortal, sexed, organized in society, obliged to work in order to live, working in accordance with certain rules. By recollecting and reenacting the myths, humans can repeat the achievements of the founders, whose vision established a good and proper order of things. Knowledge of the myth is a source of power. It allows the knower to live in a space and time detached from the present, but linked with the sacred acts of the creators. So although these discussions of myth tend to identify with traditional societies, they're really applicable to any human institution. Clubs, societies, universities, organizations all tell these stories about themselves. And I see no very good reason why we shouldn't apply the same approach to intellectual specialties like symbolic interactionism. So our American friends have a fairly straightforward narrative that makes Herbert Blumer a pivotal figure. In 1937, he publishes the origin statement, where the label symbolic interaction first appears. Actually, it probably doesn't first appear. There's some evidence it was current in Chicago, and Blumer does use it in a less well-known piece of work that appeared the previous year. But this is what is celebrated as the origin statement. Blumer is the Zeus of symbolic interactionism, the prime deity in the pantheon. But he doesn't come out of nowhere. Just as Zeus is the son of Cronus, Blumer is the heir to Mede. Although the succession is more peaceful, Zeus murdered his father Cronus, and Blumer merely inherited from Mede. The ancestry is rarely traced further back, although Cooley and Thomas are occasionally invoked, much as the ancient Greeks would sometimes recognize Cronus' descent from Uranus. The narrative pivots around Blumer, and every other hero, Becker, Goffman, Strauss, is located in some fictive kinship to Blumer. The tradition records a set of stories about insults, discourtesies, and exclusions from employment. These accumulate in a great moment of rebellion in 1974, at which a small cadre decide to establish their own society to defend Blumer's vision. In the oral retelling, the details of the foundation are lost in a haze of alcohol and tobacco. Much like any other origin myth, the circumstances of creation are often deeply obscure, and in this case, deeply obscured. Those present at the moment of creation have great difficulty in agreeing on what it is that they created and how they came to do it, apart from the fact that there was a lot of alcohol involved. Which may account for the discrepancies in the narratives. Nevertheless, a union emerges that brought together the keepers of the true wisdom. A sacred flame was passed on through times of marginalization and persecution. The face of oppression from the established institutions of American sociology, Symbolic interactionists find consolation in the glories of the past and cherish projects of reform and transformation that will give them a place in the sun. The story continues through various further small acts of opposition and defiance, particularly directed towards the American Sociological Association. True believers do not sell out, and their peer reviewers complain about those whose faith is insufficiently pure. Let me be clear. I'm not denigrating Blumer's own contributions and his importance to 20th century sociology. Blumer's methodological writings in particular should still be widely read as important challenges to certain kinds of survey work and certain kinds of positivist thinking in social science. What I am doing is questioning the cult that has grown up around his supposed legacy. Is this helpful to European scholars, or should we be approaching symbolic interactionism in a rather different way? Hold on to that question for a moment, because I now want to talk a little bit about the condition of European sociology. And in particular, I want to talk a bit about the Cold War and its legacy. And it's always a little bit chilling when I come to Poland and talk to people and realize that I first came here in 1986, which was before the Great Transformation. But it's also before an awful lot of the audiences that I've talked to or the people that I meet were ever born. And when I talk to my own students today about the Cold War, it seems impossibly remote. These are people, for students, many of them at best, they were small children, many of them were not even born in 1989. It's a bit like World War II for my generation. It was massively important experience for my parents, but it's the stuff of history. You kind of learn about it in school. It's something that's very hard to recapture. I suspect in Poland the Cold War may feel a little less remote. I mean, it still seems to matter in contemporary Polish politics precisely where politicians stood in relation to the communist state and whether this should be a matter for ostracism or reconciliation. And clearly, it's a sensitive issue in contemporary Polish politics. But I do think that we need to understand today something of the spirit of those years, to understand the context in which what counts today as European sociology was formed. In particular, we need to recognize the encounter between the national traditions in sociology that developed in the earlier part of the 20th century, confronted two transnational traditions in Marxism and structural functionalism. There's a very widely accepted history of the emergence of sociology. I mean, it was the orthodoxy when I learned sociology as an undergraduate 40 years ago that said it was a response to Marxism and other contemporary critiques of the results of rapid social and economic change in Europe. The results of these changes were thought to be disorder and chaos. Early sociologists looked for ways to restore the peace and harmony that they assumed marked pre-industrial societies as an alternative to the Marxist program of a revolutionary overthrow of the existing order. So Durkheim's guild socialism in division of labour might be an example. The sociologies that emerged tended to be highly national in character. For example, although we tend to teach Durkheim and Weber alongside each other in a curriculum, they don't actually seem to have paid much attention to each other's work. We now have kind of really quite substantial biographies of both, and it's really quite interesting to look through the index and see how few references occur there. I mean, Durkheim in particular rarely travelled outside France, although Weber did travel much more extensively. The one exception, interestingly, was the largely forgotten English sociologist Herbert Spencer, whose work was widely translated. Spencer was a huge influence in his day. travelled all over the place, spoke to packed meetings, giving public lectures, particularly in the States. His work was quite extensively ripped off by Durkheim in the Division of Labour. Simmel wrote a PhD thesis about Spencer, which was rejected by the German university to which it was submitted because the professoriate didn't really want Simmel writing about foreigners. It was the kind of ethnic complexities of German universities at the time were bad enough without dragging English figures into it. Effectively, as Parsons correctly saw in The Structure of Social Action, sociology developed against radical utilitarianism as much as represented by Spencer, as much as it developed against Marxism. It was a search for a third way between communism and amoral laissez-faire capitalism. In practice, the US, possibly because of the diverse immigrant experience, seems to be more receptive to the various European contributions to sociology than they were to each other. And I think there's a part of the story that we don't really understand very well. But if we look at the readings selected by Robert Park and Ernest Burgess for the introductory textbook that they created in 1921 for undergraduates at the University of Chicago, which was the standard text right up to World War II, was widely adopted elsewhere in the US. We see that it makes extensive use of European material. Interestingly, although Max Weber had actually visited Chicago in 1904, he doesn't actually get compiled in this set of commentary and readings. German sociology is represented by Simmel, Tönnies, and Sombart. There are extracts from Durkheim, which is kind of interesting because Durkheim really hadn't been substantially translated at this period. The main translations of Durkheim don't appear till the 1930s. Certainly extracts from Spencer and from his English critics. Mead gets 2 mentions in the textbook, but pragmatism is mainly represented by extracts from Dewey. And of course, Chicago was well connected with Poland through Thomas's collaborations with Znaniecki, and with the UK through Malinowski, was obviously also a Polish connection, and Radcliffe Brown, both of whom were regular visitors. So World War II, of course, massively disrupted all of these national sociologies and international networks. It sort of threw sociology in Europe up into the air, and quite a bit more of it settled in the United States. And at the end of the conflict, the re-establishment of sociology in Europe was very much shaped by the Cold War, by the ideological rivalries between Soviet Russia and the United States. Within the Soviet sphere of Eastern and Central Europe, behind the Iron Curtain, sociology was overshadowed by the official social theories of state socialism. Since the creation of a socialist state had, by definition, eliminated the problems that sociology claimed to address, there was no longer any place for sociology. Now, in practice, the state did find some value in empiricist social surveys to collect information about opinions and attitudes. It was a sort of substitute for competitive elections, particularly here in Poland, to some extent in Hungary. The state had a certain interest in finding out what was bothering the population in order to ensure that they didn't cause the sort of trouble that they caused in 1956 and 80-81 and so on. One of the ways to keep a lid on it was, periodic surveys of this kind. And as we were hearing yesterday, there was also some ethnography or ethnology of a sort of more antiquarian nature, documenting folk traditions that appeared to be disappearing, but which might be important for national identity. In Western Europe, however, Post-war recruitment to sociology brought a considerable intake of men and a few women who joined the Communist Party in the 1930s and in occupied Europe had fought with communist resistance groups. The UK also received a number of communist refugees from South Africa. And there's a response from the US, and again the scale of CIA covert support hasn't really been documented, but it's clear there was quite a significant investment in the creation of scholarships through various front organizations to project an alternative. The Parsons-Lausesfeld axis had become much more deeply embedded in Washington during World War II and was the immediate tool to hand when US agencies took up this challenge. So rather than being an intellectual opposition to Marxist thought, sociology in Europe became a player in the ideological competition between Russia and the US to determine the future of West European states. Old friends could be placed on opposite sides of this. So Jean-Paul Sartre and Raymond Aron, for example, who'd been friends since school days. I mean, they were real bosom buddies, but they had this huge quarrel in 1947 and never spoke again for at least 30 years. And although some of the suggestions suggest that they made up the quarrel and shook hands on it much later in life, this largely appears to be down to the fact that it was a point at which Jean-Paul Sartre was going a bit senile and didn't quite realize who he was shaking hands with. But this was sort of ceremonially staged as a great act of reconciliation in the 70s. So this competition ebbed and flowed. After the suppression of the Hungarian revolt in 1956, West European sociologists tended to leave the official communist doctrine behind. I mean, the director of the institute where I did my PhD had been a Communist Party member up to 1956, although not a very active one, and was very pleased to have the excuse to resign from the party that this represented, having become much involved in much more orthodox socialist politics. The oppositional stance to American thought remained. And through the 60s, there's a growing interest in the attempt to develop more liberal forms of Marxism in the neglected or suppressed writings of authors like Gramsci, Lukács, or the Frankfurt School. And these ideas became the inspiration for many of the young political actors of the events of 1968. I will have to confess to not being a proper soixante-huitard in the sense that I began my university education in the autumn of 1968, when most of the fun had already happened. Although in England, the echoes of Les Événements continued well into the 68-69 academic year. And in much of Western Europe, the sociological community was torn apart when pressed to decide how it stood in relation to this social movement. Were sociologists for or against the insurgency? Was sociology a conservative servant of the old left of communists and social democrats, or an ally of the new radicals? Which side of the barricades were we on? The failure of the revolutions of 1968 accentuated the divisions as each side blamed the other for the failure. Whose nerve had failed? Who had betrayed whom? And in some countries, the National Sociological Association simply imploded. There's no basis for collective professional action for the best part of a generation. I mean, the German Sociological Association had a furious row and didn't meet again for 6 or 7 years. The French just collapsed. I mean, France did not have a credible National Sociological Association again until 2002 because of the conflicts and passions aroused by the failures of 68. So the return of normal science to European sociology has been shaped by different circumstances in each country. The speed of change really reflects the kind of embedded patronage and the job security of pre-1968 leaders. So you did have quite a lot of sort of old-style, as we would say in Britain, the old tankies, the old-style communists, who'd got secure professorial positions before 1968 and continue to use the patronage that is commonly available in European university systems to maintain some of the pre-68 positions and really up until their retirement. It reflects different degrees of engagement in different countries with English-speaking social science, and it reflects the translation history of key works. Nevertheless, we can see how symbolic interactionism has been taken up in many countries as a solution to the problem of what the hell do we do now? What comes next? If the Marxist or post-Marxist analyses of the 50s and 60s have failed, and if American scientific sociology is unappealing, where do we get our inspiration from? And for some people, the answer was symbolic interactionism. So if you look at France, which is a country I'm perhaps most familiar with, you can see through the 80s and 90s this growing French interest in both symbolic interactionism and ethnomethodology. Now, I think it's really interesting that the cutting edge on the left bank in Paris is symbolic interactionism and ethnomethodology, when most of North America thinks that the cutting edge of French sociology is either Foucault or Bourdieu. Foucault is really pretty marginal as far as sociology is concerned. He's an intellectual historian, some kind of cultural historian. Bourdieu was a very divisive figure, and I'll say a few more things about Bourdieu as we go on. Again, much of the adoption of symbolic interactionism is part of the revolt against Bourdieu and everything that he stands for. And I think it's fascinating to see the hero worship of Bourdieu in the US and to some extent in the UK, without understanding the extent to which he was considered to be an intellectually discredited but politically powerful figure in his own country. So I had the opportunity to be a spectator at a major conference at Saint-Quentin en Yvelines outside Paris in '98, for example. Claude Dubar, who was one of the key promoters, was a former communist who discovered Chicago sociology towards the end of the 80s. As did a number of other French sociologists of that generation. Becker's Outsider was translated in '85, more than 20 years after its first publication. Anselm Strauss's Mirrors and Masks was translated in '92, after a first US publication in '69 and a UK edition in 1977. Alain Coulon wrote introductory texts on ethnomethodology in '87 and the Chicago School in '92. In effect, the French were discovering that there was more to American sociology than Talcott Parsons, who they'd always sort of seen as emblematic, and therefore to be to set themselves against. In Germany, on the other hand, there seems to be rather less interest, and I was kind of intrigued by the account yesterday about the influence of German scholars on symbolic interactionism in Wuj, when certainly in my own discussions with German sociologists, the figures like Luhmann and Stich tend to be far more central. But it's a kind of cybernetic model. I mean, there's virtually no human agency. And I'm sort of playing with the theory, and I'd be interested in anybody who's got any evidence on it, that to some extent pragmatism and symbolic interactionism were discredited in Germany by Habermas's attempts to use them to renew Frankfurt Marxism. And the way in which symbolic interactionism got subsumed into critical theory was not actually helpful in persuading sociologists to like it. So whereas in France interactionism came into a space left by the collapse of Marxist sociologies, in Germany it was identified with them. The UK offers another model in the sense that interactionism arrived earlier and was used as a critical tool against both Parsonian sociology and old-school Marxism. This was particularly noticeable in the so-called New Criminology, which sustained national conferences on the sociology of deviance for a number of years in the late 60s. In a way, interactionism became mainstream in a way that didn't happen anywhere else in Europe. It was the lack of a language barrier which helped. There were various misunderstandings because of the limited opportunities for travel and personal contacts. And in the course of becoming mainstream, I think UK interactionism lost some of its coherence and got diluted into a rather generic qualitative sociology. I mean, there's a definite tendency in Britain to use qualitative methods to produce illustrations for what the researcher already knows, rather than to develop or test theories in the way that interactionism would favour. Qualitative research is a tool for identity politics or for the ongoing attempts to renew or reinvent the critical tradition in the form of critical public sociology, or critical public sociology with the quotation marks, which is narrowly understood as social activism allied to any group that can claim to be disadvantaged. As my great mentor Philip Strong once observed, British sociologists are often more concerned to be right on than they are to be right, both in the sense of right as correct and as right in, oh, we might possibly be saying something that is with the small c conservative. In effect, the British developed a similar model to that created in Bourdieu, by Bourdieu in France in his use of qualitative methods, where research only confirmed what theory already knew. And this has invited a pushback, which has also been experienced in France and Germany, for a supposedly more scientific and policy-relevant sociology that is based on quantitative approaches. There's a huge investment in Britain at the moment in trying to promote the quantitative, I was going to say the quantitative literacy, but that's not, I would probably phrase that better if my brain was more in gear, but trying to promote quantitative skills among UK sociology undergraduates with a conspicuous lack of success but a very large amount of expenditure. Much as in pre-1989 Poland, there's a pressure to reduce sociology to administrative surveys or reanalyses of official statistics that won't disturb anybody. And this approach, curiously, in Britain at least, has pushed a significant number of qualitative sociologists into business and professional schools where rigorous work may be more valued. And there's, I think, an interesting emerging split in British sociology, at least, between the sociologists who are working in business schools, computer science, professional schools, communications, who are sort of finding themselves excluded from definitions of doing public sociology or being public intellectuals. Some or other, working to design more user-friendly computer software is not thought to benefit the public in the way that sort of trying to sort of stir up a tenants association on a local housing project, or sort of writing for small and limited circulation political magazines is valued. So symbolic interactionism means different things in different parts of Europe. It's asked to perform somewhat different functions for different national communities. But I think there are three common contributions that it's called upon to make to the development of novel kinds of critical politics, to the erasure of past conflicts within the discipline, and to the legitimation of an alternative to the established structures and practices of the institutions within which European sociology is conducted. I'm going to look at each of these briefly in turn, but before I do that, I just want to say a little bit more about the American origin myth. Just bear with me for a moment. So the main problem with the origin myth is the way in which it places Bloomer at the centre of the story, rather than seeing his contribution as one of at least three threads, each of which has a rather different character. One thing that's really important to remember is that Bloomer's origin statement is really only a claim to divine social psychology. Bloomer's chapter, from which this comes, is a chapter on social psychology in an undergraduate textbook where he's making a statement in competition with the orthodoxy in psychology at Chicago. Other people write, there are two chapters on sociology in this particular textbook, which was intended essentially as reading for a first-year course in social science, more generally, in general social science, at the University of Minnesota. So that, we're immediately raising a problem for ourselves by assuming that Bloomer is laying out a program for sociology. He's laying out a program for social psychology, and that's not the same thing. As Daniel Hübner's work has recently shown, the conventional understanding of Mead is based on some fairly significant reconstructions of his work by editors and commentators. Mead's networks at Chicago long predated Bloomer's arrival. W.I. Thomas took Mead's first class in 1894, just after Thomas was appointed as a graduate instructor, and they seem to have exercised a mutual influence for many years, which we don't know a great deal about. It's good evidence of the respect for Mead's contribution by Chicago sociologists well before Bloomer began taking his courses in 1923. Moreover, although Bloomer did become Mead's assistant and inherit some of his classes, his studies had, of course, included courses with most of the leading figures in sociology and psychology who were working in Chicago in the 1920s. It's also worth noting that contemporary Chicago faculty, and in particular Bloomer's peers among the graduate students, seem to consider that he was a bit of an outlier, even within the Chicago approach. If you worked with Bloomer, you might come to share his obsession with Mead, but not very many people did. Bloomer did not leave a trail of PhD students in the same way as Everett Hughes, for example. So mentioning Hughes introduces the second thread, namely the ecological or evolutionary thinking that he derived from Park, Burgess, and Mackenzie's work in urban sociology and translated to the study of work, organizations, and occupations. In effect, this line of work stripped evolutionary thought of the teleology that had been introduced by social Darwinism. I mean, in this tradition, stuff just happens. And that's actually a really challenging thing for sociologists. We are very locked into the idea of there is a narrative in history. Partly that comes from Marx, partly it comes from Spencer, partly it comes from various other sources that somehow or other, and in a way that historians have long abandoned, there's this idea that there is a grand narrative in history. There is an inevitability of progress. We are going somewhere. And what the Chicago evolutionary thought did was essentially to say that this is just how it is. It's the present and transient outcomes of continuing processes. There's no big story. It's actually much more faithful to Darwin and to the social scientists who influenced him, like Smith and Malthus. Moral judgments could be made about the consequences, and activists might try to shape the processes, but sociology itself was agnostic. And alongside this, we have another thread from anthropology, the way in which the methods, in particular, transferred across, and particularly the anthropological influence on Goffman. Goffman is far more of an anthropologist than most of his contemporaries, looking to the British tradition in Radcliffe Brown's work as mediated through Lloyd Warner, looking towards Durkheim to a considerable extent, and also sharing the moral flatness of that's distinctive about the Chicago work. It's very striking when you read Asylums. It's full of great stuff, but it's not actually the moral critique is implicit rather than explicit. And a lot of the moral critique has been read back into Asylums by subsequent commentators. And we might recall Goffman lays out what he finds and leaves the judgments to others. I still love the conclusion to his ASA presidential address, where he says he trade most of American sociology for a few good concepts and a cold beer. And I think it's sort of really kind of puncturing the pretensions of a lot of his peers. By placing Bloomer at the centre of the story, the origin myth prioritises one particular current in this stream of work and reinforces the marginalisation of symbolic interactionism. One of the things that I'm tempted to speculate about is whether American interactionists are interactionist enough about their own claims to being excluded from mainstream American sociology, and the extent to which, in a sense, they may have contributed at various times to their own exclusion. That, I think, raises a vital question for European sociologists. And I want to come back to this issue of the contingent relationships, which, skipped a few of these. The contingent relationships and what, in a sense, we are trying to achieve here. We're not, I think, trying to achieve a unification of national traditions, but we're trying to import a way of doing sociology that does not seem to have any roots in Europe, but which may offer a way of transcending national differences. And that is the note on which I want to finish, perhaps a little more briefly than I'd intended to. I want to present, though, two particular challenges to European sociologists interested in symbolic interactionism. The first is to ask whether we're really promoting a particular version centred on Bloomer and Mead that has come to dominate in the US, or whether what we're really doing is rediscovering a more eclectic sociology that would simply have represented mainstream US work before 1939. And the second is to ask whether some of the claims that this sociology has a socially transformative potential are really justified. So I think that, to deal very briefly with that first, that we might want to think a great deal more about the extent to which what the Americans were doing was synthesizing European traditions and to reconnect that and to retell that story and to embed the story in the experiences of our own continent and the way in which to recognize the way in which the American synthesis transcended the nationalization. But I also want to say a little bit more about where we stand in relation to this obsession with social critique. People talk about economics as the dismal science. Phil Strong used to talk about it as the glum science. That sociologists were never happier than when they were criticizing something. They were wonderful people at seeing half-empty glasses. And many of our colleagues can only see the deficiencies of the actually existing world relative to some utopia that they would like to prescribe for everybody else. Public sociology is a project of professional imperialism, which has the same democratic flaws that all such projects have. And people claim a kind of revolutionary potential. At one level, this is understandable because of our emphasis on a common humanity and the contingent nature of the labeling process. But again, many of the questioning of these things goes back much earlier than symbolic interactionism. It's back to the early 30s, for example. And Bloom himself doesn't see states as constructing good societies, but merely ensuring open and fair competition between interests. He's a good American liberal, which places him somewhere to the right of most European social democrats and many Christian Democrats. I mean, the philosophical traditions that feed the mainstream version of interactionist sociology are all more or less liberal or libertarian. They emphasize the individual, the local, the contingent, rather than the collective, the societal, and the planned. This doesn't mean that they cannot be, in some sense, progressive, but they are intrinsically suspicious of teleology, of utopias. These traditions tend to accept that markets are probably the most ingenious human invention for meeting individual wants, needs, desires, and preferences. Sometimes markets fail because the real world doesn't match the fictions of neoclassical economics. Interventions may sometimes be necessary, but the primary drivers of social change are in the way we act towards each other as individuals and the moral compass that guides this. The sociologist is not the ally of the planner or the legislator, but the critical friend of the citizen. Utopias and dystopias have their place in the novels of science fiction or the programs of politicians. Sociologists don't need to add to them. So why am I not a symbolic interactionist? I'm not a symbolic interactionist because I choose to work across the whole of what would have been considered to be mainstream US sociological thought before World War II. I'm not a symbolic interactionist because I recognize the diversity of influences that shape that mainstream, many of which came from Europe. I'm not a symbolic interactionist because I accept the distance between sociological understanding and political or moral prescription that comes with that mainstream. The politics of my sociology are implicit in its emphasis on a common humanity and on the importance of understanding human actions in context. But, as I've said before, it's a stance that applies equally to top dogs, bottom dogs, and lap dogs. No single breed has a privilege to claim on our attention.
We can start discussion, please. Robert.
Sure. Very interesting presentation, Robert. But as you might expect, I disagree with a lot of the things you said. I'll try and be succinct. First of all, one of the things I'd like to make clear is that the American pragmatist tradition is really not an American tradition in any pure sense. It's really an extension of classical Greek world, and more particularly the philosophy of Aristotle. There's a great deal of Plato's works that also are very informative, trace the development of Western social thought over the years. Try this one. You will find, is that a little better? Okay. So in a lot of ways, symbolic interaction really goes back to our roots. We're basically all Greek. And this is something that often gets overlooked, and this might be part of the mythos that I would agree with Robert, because there's this emphasis in textbook accounts of social theory that only in America, wild wilderness and individuality and freedom of speech and all these other things, could you have such a thing as pragmatist social thought? Well, of course, it's nonsense. But I can provide lots of evidence pertaining to that over the millennia. But Herbert Blumer, in a sense, I don't know if anybody who provides a more coherent statement on theory, methods, research, comparative analysis, and conceptuality than does Herbert Blumer. Herbert Blumer certainly built on the people that he worked with. One of the things, relatedly, I found a little bit difficult to follow with your presentation, Robert, was that you started to engage so many different topics, contexts, and I think it's important for sociologists to be mindful of their terms of reference and to try and maintain more sustained context. Myself, I have to admit, I'm really pleased to see the extent to which symbolic interaction is being accepted in Europe. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. Just recently, I was asked by a Russian scholar who's doing a reprint, a translation of Herbert Blumer's Symbolic Interactionism to write a preface to the book. Remember when Russia got Coca-Cola? We knew it was a good sign. Now it seems that they're getting Herbert Blumer. Anyways, Robert, I'll give you a chance to talk back to me.
Can we take some more questions?
Sure, by all means.
I'd like to sit for a minute.
Okay. This is for you.
Robert, towards the end, you referred to the US tradition, to Europe. Can I take it then that although you're not a symbolic interactionist, that you work towards some other integrated sociological paradigm? That you may try to incorporate different readings, and I'm not only thinking of Bourdieu's suggestion of an integration or a relational methodology between social physics and social phenomenology. I also think particularly of the integration of the researcher in this whole process of clearing up the mystery. So, yeah.
Just a comment or two. I have to say I'm a bit confused about the aim of your discussion. It was certainly rich in topics and rich in ideas, but I'm not sure if you were speaking about Blumer and his work, about what people have tried to make of Bloomer over the years, or whether you're talking about the decline of intellectual life in many, many countries during the Cold War period. And either one of those would be the grounds for a strong statement. Perhaps I'm somewhat sympathetic to the position that you first outlined in your comments, Robert.
Some more questions, comments? Oh, okay. Sorry. But you should use it.
First off, I think we missed all the best slides at the end, didn't we? When you click through, I thought, oh no, I want to see that. I thought when you talk about Germany, you're absolutely correct about that. I just, just as a sharing opportunity, it's exactly my experience when I got into symbolic interaction. I wrote one or two things about labeling, and the German criminologists, all very far leftist, loved me immediately, invited me to all their things, because of course labeling theory in Germany got adapted by critical theorists as a way to analyze what the evil state does with the poor people that get labeled, which I mean in the US has also been one of the understandings of the approach, but then of course also quickly been recanted. But we had that, and I wrote that, and then I got invited to the meetings, and they were wonderfully nice to me until I wrote a couple more things about it, and they realized that my understanding wasn't exactly theirs, and they cooled considerably towards me after that. So in Germany, you have that. To connect it back to what you said, you don't have that reception through Bloomer originally, you have it through Becker and through the labeling approach people, and then afterwards the people who came, like Fritz Sack in Germany, who went to California and met these people and came back and brought something that they could wonderfully use in critical theory. That then later led to them trying to find Bloomer and adapting that, when then, of course, they found the harsh criticism towards quantitative social science, which they also loved and would also adapt to it. So you have that, and that lasts maybe for about 20, 25 years. And then you get that second strand where Strauss gets received. And the second strand where Strauss gets received is completely different, because now you have the sociology of knowledge people. Now you have, in education, people who do biography studies receiving it, but through completely different channels. And the channels that they start receiving this from now get filtered. It also plays back into what you said. Now that gets filtered to the French sociologists, because now a lot of that is science and technology studies. A lot of that goes to the French reception of pragmatism that you've also outlined. And then you have that second line going in. And these two lines, to my understanding in Germany, have never talked. Like, I'm in both groups, right? I mean, I overdid it. I'm still meeting the criminologists, and I'm getting along fine with them, but they never appear, those two groups never appear on the same conferences. They never appear together to do anything together. They're two completely different receptions of the thing that hardly ever talk. So that's, just as an aside and as a fascinating thing to tie into what you said.
Okay, thank you.
Robert, you said a lot of very interesting things, and this is a great kind of discussion. It's a very intellectual kind of discussion, which we probably could use a lot of in our discipline. But my concern is the following, and after being witness and party to this type of discussion in the past, it seems like we get done talking and we go on to do our work. And I just wonder how much impact this type of discussion has on what we do as everyday life sociologists and interactionists. And I'm just and so I guess my request is for you to mention just how would this in fact translate into impact in terms of giving us direction in our work, or providing us audiences for our work, or something like that.
Yeah, I'll take some of these points. Bob, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with some of what you're saying on the issue of the history of of pragmatism. I mean, you and I have debated in the past about precisely which ancient Greeks we should be looking to, and I know we have different views on that. It's also the case that pragmatism owes a great deal to 18th century Scotland and 18th century Scottish thought, because the first wave of teachers in American universities were largely Scottish-trained academics, and the classic American university model is very closely based on Scottish models of university education. So I think it's sort of part of I mean, there's also clearly the German influence. I mean, the extent to which the key pragmatists had either taken German degrees or at least studied in Germany for a period. So I think it's always been an error to see pragmatism as a purely American contribution to philosophy and social thought, although one that is widely repeated, especially in certain undergraduate texts. And I do think there's a good deal more to be said about that part of the story. I think there were a couple of questions that sort of faced around. What's the synthesis? What's the integration? I mean, I don't think that I sort of see this presentation as being in that business so much as being critical of the idea that there is a grand synthesis, or being suspicious of that, and partly inspired, I think, by the experience of of examining a PhD in England for a student who'd done an organizational study and called herself a symbolic interactionist, and had tried to do the entire thing only on the basis of reading Bloomer, and was very distressed when the other examiner and I pointed out that you couldn't really write an organizational study without some consideration of the work of Strauss and his colleagues. And she was duly mortified, as was her supervisor. But it did occur to me that this was a young woman who had been severely misled into thinking about orthodoxies and coherence and the kinds of narratives that we had as sociologists. And this partly goes to your point, Joe, about to what extent do we have a big overarching story as opposed to a bunch of stuff that helps us understand the world. And if you look to the sort of libertarian, liberal philosophers which are the sort of more natural macro partners of the kinds of examinations of everyday phenomena that we go in for, then there is this kind of recurrent suspicion of, there is a big story to be told, there is a grand synthesis, as opposed to there are some useful things that help us get through life, that we manage from one challenge to the next rather than having a coherent direction, and which is reflected, if you like, in the Chicago, the urban sociology of 1920 Chicago, which is reflected in the Hughes sociology of work, and this idea that stuff happens in the world, we may be able to understand a little bit about how and why it comes to happen, but this does not kind of privilege our accounts of history, our accounts of the future, our ability to plan and direct, and that if you're saying, well, what's the impact on, what should be the impact on what we're doing, I would say perhaps a little more humility than some of our peers in the profession about presuming to tell the world what's good for it, as opposed to helping to explain how this bit of the world happens to work at this particular time and place relative to other similar bits of the world in other times and places. So in a way it is deliberately, one or two people are saying, well, there's a lot of stuff here and it's not maybe very well connected up, and that may well be true, but to some extent it's also a deliberate non-connection that's a skepticism, if you like, about this idea that there is a big story, as opposed to some useful ideas that help to illuminate some bits of human experience.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, we should finish because we are very tense in the time. And then let's go for a short break, coffee, and to the next sessions.